Hi guys, so today I'm going to be talking about and teaching you a little bit about the four correlations that we were told to read in the book. So I'll start out with bivariate correlation. So bivariate correlation is the measure or the strength between two variables. So if you want to follow along, this is on page 344. And the first thing we need to do when we're doing bivariate correlation is we want to check for bias. And the best two ways to check for bias are through linearity or normality. And we learned about these previously in the semester. And we also learned about assumption testing. And those assumption testing can be done through linearity and normality. So for linearity, for the relationship to be valid, the variables need to be linear. So outcome variables need to be measured at an interval or ratio level, and so does the predictor variable. For normality, we only care about this if you're doing significance testing, confidence intervals, or if you have a small sample size. But we can tell if the assumptions are met by using linearity and normality, and if assumptions are met, then you want to go ahead and use the Pearson correlation coefficient. And if assumptions are not met, you'll go ahead and use a non-parametric test such as the Spearman or Kendall's correlation coefficient. So moving on to biserial correlation, this one starts on page 354. Biserial correlation is it's kind of the same as bivariate correlation where you're measuring the relationship between two variables, but for biserial, one of the variables has to be dichotomous. So a dichotomous variable is basically like either a yes or no question, or like you're pregnant or you're not pregnant. So there can only be basically two answers that you can choose from, and you can only fall into one category. So you can also have point biserial correlation, and this is where, like I just mentioned, you're either pregnant or you're not pregnant. You're not kind of pregnant or sort of pregnant. You either are or you aren't. Whereas the biserial correlation can also be continuous. And by continuous, I mean that, an example that the book gave for this one is that when measuring exam scores, you can either pass or you can either fail the exam. But it can be continuous in a way that there's a scale of how you passed or how you failed. So for example, you can either pass really close to 100 or you can pass closer to 70%. And for failed, you can either fail closer to 0 or you can fail closer to the 50% mark. So that's an example of biserial correlation and point biserial correlation. And both of them are still dichotomous, even though one of them is more continuous than the other. Moving on to partial correlation. I feel like partial correlation and semi-partial correlation were probably the more difficult ones for me to wrap my mind around. But partial correlation measures the relationship between two variables, controlling the effect that the third variable has on both of the other two variables, while semi-partial correlation measures the relationship between two variables, controlling the effect that the third variable has on only one of the other two variables. So because I was a little bit more confused on this one, I went back to Dr. Landry's notes that she had added for us and looked at these two pictures. I feel like these helped me a lot. Mainly this one up here helped because you can see in the white box this is showing a partial correlation because you can see that both the two variables have an effect on the other variable, if that makes sense. So for example, the book gave us that a semi-partial correlation would be how revision and anxiety affect the exam score, while partial correlation would be how revision affects anxiety, how revision affects the exam, and how anxiety affects the exam. So semi-partial is where or how the variable affects two other variables, and then the partial correlation is how the third variable has an effect on both of the other two variables. So that one was definitely a little bit more confusing for me to wrap my mind around, and it's even a little bit confusing for me to explain. So I'll probably definitely be watching y'all's videos to get a little bit more clarity on that. And for me, the bivariate and biserial were a little bit easier to understand just because we had already learned the basics about linearity, normality, assumption testings, and like what dichotomous meant. So hopefully y'all learned something today about the correlations between variables, and hopefully I'll learn something from you guys. So thanks for watching.